It can be hard to find baking mixes right now, but you can easily make one yourself with the ingredients you hopefully still have at home. And then you'll have prepared baking mix that's ready when you're ready to cook, whether you want to make pancakes in the morning or muffins or biscuits or even cookies. So this is a great thing to just mix up when you have a little bit of downtime, set it aside in your pantry or your fridge, and then you'll have it ready to go. So the main part of baking mix, not surprisingly, is flour. I do still have some flour at home, and this recipe says that you can call for either all white flour or all wheat flour or a mix of both. So I'm gonna use a mix of both. So I've already measured out some flour from each, but I'm going to measure out 1 last cup here of white whole wheat flour and 1 final cup of white all-purpose flour. And the great thing about this recipe is that you can make the whole batch, which uses 9 cups of flour total, or it's pretty easy to cut in half. It's a pretty basic recipe. And so if you don't want to use that much or you don't want to make that much, you could just make half the batch and you're good to go. So that's all my flour. Then the next thing that we're going to use in this mix, which is probably not going to be a surprise, is some non-fat dry milk powder, or you could use dried buttermilk powder if you had that. I actually had the buttermilk powder, so I'm going to use that. If you had dry non-fat milk, you could use that too. A cup of that. And then you're going to add 5 tablespoons of baking powder. Make sure you double check your label. You don't want to use baking soda, you want to use baking powder. So you just add that in. And then you'd want to use a 1/4 cup of sugar. I don't happen to have any sugar except for some coconut sugar, so I'm using that today. But if you have white sugar around, that's obviously great. And then you're also going to use a tablespoon of salt, any salt you have. And then finally, this recipe calls for a cup of vegetable shortening. If you don't want to use vegetable shortening or you don't have that, you could use butter. And one trick for butter is to grate it on a grater. I put this in the freezer beforehand and I already grated some before we started. So I'm just gonna finish that up. If you freeze the cheese, it makes it really easy to grate and not fall apart. And then when you go to mix it into your batter, it'll be all mixed in throughout, and that will be great. And I think, here we go. So it almost looks like cheese. Isn't that great? And so we'll add that in, and because I used butter, I'll be keeping this in the refrigerator. I think also I use the buttermilk powder, so it's also good to keep in the refrigerator, but if you use more shelf-stable items like the milk powder or the shortening, you could keep it in the pantry. So I'll put that in there. And that's it. That's the whole thing. So you're just gonna mix that all up. And actually, because I used the buttermilk powder, I think I'll just add just a pinch of this baking soda. So I'm gonna mix that all up. As you can see, it looks like just crumbly mix. That's really it. And then I pre-labeled, using my label maker, a jar that just says DIY baking mix, and then I'll put a little note on here. If you want to use pancakes, you use 2 cups of this mix, and if you want to make biscuits, you use 1.5 cups. And so when we're ready to cook, we can just know how much we need and then get started either using our regular recipe or finding a recipe on allrecipes.com that uses baking mix. I will be honest, my dream is that I hope that my boys can start to make their own pancakes for breakfast, which would be great as we're all home and they could learn some new cooking skills. So I know we make a lot of pancakes in this house, so this will definitely get used. All right, that's 2 cups of this mix in the jar, and I'm ready to go. If you want more ideas or other baking mix options, there's more recipes on allrecipes.com and lots of recipes to use this in. So happy baking.